You know, we started this series last week by talking about how we really do live in a world where our legitimate problems are often approached with what we would call a self-help book mentality. And too often we look for easy solutions and want to follow just a few simple steps to our family issues, when truthfully, most of our family issues stem from problems that are much more, and I mean much more, complicated than that. We then jumped in last week to the book of Colossians, and it's a book whose sole focus, we said, was to help its readers understand that as a follower of Jesus, we're called to live lives that are completely 100% focused on what? On bringing him glory, right? Paul's point that he was trying to make in the passage that we looked at last week is that pleasing God really has a lot less to do with the mechanics of what we do, and it has more to do with who you are and who you are allowing God to create in you. We also talked last week about how the theme of Colossians, if you could boil it all down into one sentence, it would be Jesus is all and he is in all. And if he is the one that we're setting our compass towards, then every area of our life is going to be impacted by that fact, right? And it's through that set of lenses that we need to be able to look at the passage that we're going to be looking at this morning as well, because when you read it, it's making the assumption that your life is already pointed in that direction. It might seem like I'm belaboring this point because I talked about that quite a bit last week as well. And I likely am belaboring it because the verses that we're going to look at this morning are likely some of the most misused and misunderstood words in the New Testament. In fact, they're taken out of its original context, I would guess, probably more than any other passage of Scripture on this issue. And because it's dealing with our roles in marriage, it's important that we get to the true point, the nuts and the bolts of what Paul is trying to say here. The passage is often misused as a statement intended to, in some ways, define our modern gender roles, rather than being this wonderful, freeing, clear directive on how couples can better learn to love each other. And it's with all that said that the section in Colossians that we're going to be looking at this morning is talking about the role of husbands and wives. And it's important that we understand that Paul was speaking these words to a specific group of people from a specific culture, and he's addressing and trying to help them resolve some very specific issues that were plaguing the families in this church. My fear is that we so often read this passage out of context through the lenses of our 21st century culture. And this morning, I want to try and get you to take those glasses off and put on the same lenses that the people hearing it back then for the first time were wearing. And I think what you're going to do, if you can do that, is you're going to find that this passage actually becomes even more relevant to us than maybe it was before. As Paul wrote these words to the Colossian church, remember that the family life in the Roman Empire was in shambles. And we touched on that last week. Adultery was commonplace. Women had no rights. Wives were seen as little more than possessions. And things were spiraling out of control with these families. And then something incredible happened to them. Something truly amazing happened to these people. And that's that they had this encounter, this supernatural encounter with the message of Jesus, and their lives were never the same again. Jesus came into these people's lives, and they were saying to Paul, help us to make sense of what God really intended our roles and our families to be. They were saying to Paul, show us what a Jesus-honoring family even looks like, because they had no idea. And that's what Paul is attempting to help them do in this passage in Colossians. His advice in Colossians 3 is straightforward, it's simple. And first of all, he's saying focus first on getting your own personal compass pointing in God's direction, and then begin working on your marriage and family issues. So if you can imagine that you are part of that Roman culture this morning, and Paul, knowing your struggles, offers you these two verses, just two sentences that are intended to address their specific issues. To those cultural and personal issues, this is what Paul writes in Colossians 3, verses 18 and 19. He says this. He says, "Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and do not be harsh with them." So you're sitting there listening to this, probably thinking, okay, now let's be honest with each other, because if you're in a family unit that was struggling, would you find that advice to be at all helpful to your situation? If you're living in that culture, a culture where men are authoritarians and most often power mongers, and they're that way because that's what they were taught from their dads, that's what they witnessed from their families growing up. If you're living in a culture where women are fearful and they have no rights, and you have this encounter with Jesus, and you're now looking to integrate his teachings and this newfound faith with a family model that does not promote those things, I'm wondering, do you find those two verses to be helpful? Well, maybe, but you might just be scratching your head a little and hoping for something a little bit more practical than just those two sentences. Understand that some have suggested, and I tend to agree with them, that these words were really intended to act as reminders to the Colossian church. They were intended to act as triggers to things that Paul had actually previously spoken about in another letter of his. Paul, as you know, would often write letters to the churches, and one church community would get a letter with some great teaching in it, and it would be circulated to the other churches, who would in turn pass it on to others, and that was the tradition of the time. They had no New Testament to learn from. A lot of how they learned was through the people who had actually walked and talked with Jesus, through these letters that were passed around to the churches. That's how they learned. Some have suggested that Paul was offering these two sentences as a way of reminding the church of something that he had previously written about on this subject. And it was intended to, in a sense, trigger people to go back and look at another letter that he had written, actually to the Ephesian church, where he had given the group of people advice on family roles and how to live in a family unit and how to work out what it means to put Christ first in your family. That passage is actually found in Ephesians 5, and in these verses, Paul spends most of his time camping out on a word, and that word is submit. And he expands on what the word really means in the context of two people who have intentionally focused their lives on following Christ. In Ephesians 5, Paul's really going beyond what he's talking about in Colossians 3, and for these young Christians with their young faith, he's offering them really three, what I would call countercultural foundational principles for building healthy relationships with your spouses. And this morning, we want to spend some time digging deeper into those three principles. So the first foundational principle is found in verse 21 of Ephesians 5. And simply put, it's this: spouses are called, and hear this, spouses are called to practice the spiritual discipline of mutual submission. Spouses are called to practice the spiritual discipline of mutual submission. He starts off this section by saying in verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now, this particular verse is intended to be the basis or the foundation for the rest of the chapter. And it's intended to be, in a sense, the filter that we use for interpreting all of the other verses. It's functioning as kind of an introduction to this new way of being married, or this new picture of what marriage can be. And Paul is suggesting that rather than having marriage look like what it did before Jesus became the most important part of their lives, Paul's saying, here's a new model or an overarching goal, something that you should be striving for. When we think of the word submit or submission, I think you'd agree with me that our culture often thinks of that as a bad thing. Would you agree? I mean, our motto of the age could be outwit, outplay, outlast. It certainly wouldn't be submit. And this was even more so in the Roman Empire. Submitting was seen as a sign of weakness. No husband would even think of doing that to his wife. And wives often submitted begrudgingly because they really had no other option, did they? It was the law. And once again, we see God's values. We're about to turn the culture's values upside down. The new counterculture perspective, simply stated by Paul, was we have to learn what it means to submit to one another. But did you catch the motivation for submitting? Paul is saying this to couples. He's saying, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. There's a countercultural equality here and a call to submit to one another because of our relationship with Christ. The word submission, it's actually a fascinating word. It's a military term in the original language that means to line up under the authority of someone. This isn't an abuse of authority, but it comes with this idea of a graciousness and a working together. And remember that this is being told to both the husband and the wife. One of my favorite authors talks about this passage, and he says that, so when somebody asks the question based on this passage, who wears the pants in the family? The correct answer, and Paul's answer to that, is Christ wears the pants in my family. Jesus is supposed to be the one that wears the pants in our families. He's saying mutually submit to each other and make him the focus and direction of our lives and our relationship. The biblical word used in this passage, again, that we translate as submit, it also means to voluntarily make the decision to place yourself under someone's authority. Voluntarily to do that. It's something you choose to do. It's something you willingly do. And in the context, it really is, in every sense of the word, it's a call to harmony. It's a call to unity. It's a call to this organic kind of give and take in our relationships. But again, it's all given with the assumption that the two people are mutually committed to seeing God work in their lives, and they've already put him in that central position. You know, the point that I really don't want us to lose here is that even though we live in a culture that is so different from the culture that Paul was speaking to, there are so many nuggets of truth here that, if we're willing to accept, might just be the answer to some of our struggling relationships. Our problem today with this whole idea of submission is that we tend to look at it in the context of our different roles, don't we? Where this passage talks about submission as being a spiritual discipline. In fact, if you embrace this way, submitting is something you do to your spouse, but it really is something that ultimately you're doing for Christ. Have you ever thought about it that way before? I think our problem is that we look at submitting as being someone else's doormat, don't we? Or being lesser than someone else, or maybe even letting someone else walk all over us, and we get up in arms about that and we say, I'm never going to let anybody treat me that way. Where Paul says that we need to learn to submit to God and his greater will. We all need to learn to voluntarily submit to each other. And in a family relationship, we all need to figure out what this mutual submission is and understand that it has everything to do with our compasses being set in God's direction. So Paul's teaching that submission in marriage is an act of respect for Christ, not an issue of rights or privileges or top dog status. You are yielding to Christ first. The second foundational principle talked about in this passage is directly and specifically speaking to wives, and it's found in Ephesians 5, starting at verse 22. And simply put, wives are called to practice the spiritual discipline of mutual submission by first learning to respect their husbands. And Paul gets pretty specific with this advice, and he's suggesting that there is a preferred way for wives to practice the spiritual discipline of submission with their husbands. He says, start with learning what it means to show him respect. The passage reads, wives, submit to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. I know some of you have heard of, and maybe you've even worked through the Love and Respect book by Dr. Engrich before. But in it, he talks about how the most important need that a man has in a relationship is to feel respected. It's not loved, it's to feel respected. And often how he feels about himself is dictated by how he is shown that respect by his wife and his family. So Paul is saying here, wives, help your men to feel confident in their God-given role by treating them with respect. And again, not to overstate this, but the assumption here is that he is actively working at setting his compass in God's direction. It's so interesting here that the example used to illustrate the point is what? It's Jesus' relationship with the church. It says, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is head of the church, his body of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands. I really don't think it is at all possible for us here this morning to fully grasp just how powerful this statement would have been received by the people back then. Wives really didn't have any context for understanding what Paul was talking about, but his concept of mutual submission and using the church's example of submitting to Christ, well, that was something that they could grasp. Because keep in mind, the church was still very young, and people were still learning and growing in their understanding of what the church was meant to be. And here was Paul using this relationship as his example. So, let's just pause here for a minute and think about really what that statement means. The church willingly submits to Christ. Why? Because they understand that Christ has sacrificed everything for the church. Because they understand that Christ is looking out for the best interest of the church. Because they understand that Christ loves the church and will provide for all of its needs. And Paul is saying to wives, when your husband is loving you in that same way, your response back to him should be the practice of spiritual discipline of submission by showing respect for the role that he is trying to fulfill. I know that some of you use the CEV translation, and it actually doesn't use the word submit in this passage. It uses the verses, or in these verses, it says this, it says, a wife should put her husband first. And Eugene Peterson in the Message puts it this way. It says, wives, understand and support your husbands. So when you think about it, the act of submission really is the ultimate example of love and respect. Again, Jesus submitted to the will of his Father, and that it was the world's greatest example of love. Jesus submitted to his Father and sacrificed for the church. And why did he do it? He did it because he loved you, he loved me, and he loved the church. John 15:13 says, greater love has no one than this, than they lay down their life for their friend. Christ submitted to the will of his Father and sacrificed his life because of his love for us. His sacrifice showed the depth of his love for us. And to wives, Paul is saying this. He's saying, you want a measuring stick? You want a goal to be striving for? Do you need an example of submission to base your respect for your husband on? He says, use the church's relationship to Christ as your example. You know, Agatha Christie, the famous mystery novel writer, was being interviewed by a reporter, and the reporter asked the question why she ended up marrying an archaeologist. And Agatha Christie said, an archaeologist is the best husband a woman could have, because the older I get, the more interesting I become. And, you know, Paul would suggest that the more you can learn to express mutual submission through showing him respect, the stronger that your marriage will be. Well, that's the second principle. The third foundational principle is directed at husbands. And it's found in Ephesians 5, starting at verse 25. And putting it plainly, Paul is saying Paul is telling husbands to practice the spiritual discipline of mutual submission by first learning to love their wives. He's telling them to practice the spiritual discipline of mutual submission by first learning to love your wives. In these verses, Paul's telling husbands how they are to put this mutual submission into practice. And this is what the passage says, starting in verse 25. It says, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. Again, keeping in mind, not as a possession, as was the case back then. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church, for we are members of his body. A better translation of that first line, husbands, love your wives, is actually, and this becomes very important if you understand the Roman culture. The more accurate translation is, husbands, love your own wives. And it's important that we know that because Paul is addressing the cultural issue of adultery here. And he's saying that although the culture may give men permission to be unfaithful, that this new way of life that they found in Jesus commands that you discover the joys and the benefits that come with loving your own wife and remaining loyal to her. You know, Valerie Ruan tells this funny story. She says, after their last child left home for college, she says, my husband was resting next to me on the couch with his head on my lap, and I carefully removed his glasses, looked at him in the eyes, and told him sweetly, you know, honey, without your glasses, you look like the handsome man that I married. And he looked up at her without his glasses and said, honey, without my glasses, you still look pretty good too. But you know, the role of a husband that truly wants to love his wife, and not just with words, starts by learning to submit to her and her needs. Paul says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So just as wives are told to use Christ's relationship with the church as their example, Paul is saying the same thing to husbands. Many of you might know this, but the ancient Greeks had 4 different words for love. All the words that we would translate in Scripture as love, they actually had 4 different words for love. Eros is the first one, and we might guess from that word that it refers to erotic love. It refers to a love that's driven by passion or lust or desire. Storge refers to a family love, the love between a parent and a child or between family members in general, and this is driven by blood. Philia is the love of deep friendship and partnership. It's this fondness or a love that's driven by common interests or affections. Agape is the 4th word for love, and this is the word that Paul is using in this passage. And Paul's real point to address this higher kind of love between a husband and wife, this agape love, because agape describes the love that is more of a decision that you make and a way of life that you choose with somebody. And understand that this love is as much a matter of the mind as it is the heart, because it's a love that is chosen, even when that love is undeserving. As one author puts this, says agape has to do with the mind, not simply an emotion which arises in our hearts. It is a principle by which we deliberately choose to live. Agape really doesn't have much to do with feelings, but it has everything to do with the daily decisions we make in our relationships. In this passage, we see the example of agape used in 2 different ways. Firstly, to describe Christ and his love for the church, but secondly, as the goal that husbands should be striving for. Paul is saying to husbands, you know, you want to love your wife? Flowers might work sometimes, or chocolate might be effective at other times. But he says, try perfecting the art of agape love. And a great place to start is by showing mutual submission. I really don't think we can grasp just how counterculture this was heard, and maybe it still is today. Paul is saying that rather than treating her like a possession, husbands, love your wives, make her holy, Present her as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. Again, he says, in the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. Feed and care for her, just as Christ does the church. Interesting, again, the words feed and care that are found in verse 29 are better translated as a single word, and that word is nourish. And it's a word that means to bring to maturity. And it's our job as husbands to encourage our wives' spiritual growth. Paul says that you practice the spiritual discipline of mutual submission by investing your life into learning what it means, husbands, to cherish her, to care for her. And as you learn to nurture her and as you learn to love her with a pure agape love. You know, I love the way Paul closes off this passage. I can just see him kind of taking a step back, and he's just offered the church this life-transforming, countercultural perspective on marriage. And then he concludes with these words. Starting in verse 31, he says, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother to be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." This is a profound mystery. But I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. This is not a passage about defining roles, my friends, or forced submission, or determining family hierarchies. This passage is a prescription for healing a relational disease. It's a call to a higher level of living in our relationships with one another, where our compasses are set to our focus, to focus our lives on Christ. People who reduce these passages to defined gender role doctrines, I think, are often the ones that just don't understand that the solution to so many of our relational challenges rest in our understanding of what mutual submission really is about. And really, all Paul is encouraging these families to do, these husbands and wives to do, is what we as followers of Jesus should already be doing, and that's following Christ's example. It has less to do with what you do mechanically and more to do with who you are and who you are letting Christ mold you into. So, when somebody asks you the question about your family, who's in charge, or who wears the pants around here, the correct answer is that Jesus is in charge. Jesus wears the pants around here. And we, you and I, are merely those little metal pins on that compass that are looking to point in God's direction. Bow with me as we pray. God, thank you so much for this powerful teaching. And I don't know what part of this you are taking and using in people's hearts right now. But Jesus, you know that there are married people here. There are people who are not married. There are teenagers in the room and young adults. And Father, I pray that there would be an element of truth that we could all take and hold on to from these passages. I thank you that your goal for all of us, whether we're married or single, is to understand fully what it means to follow after the example that you have given, that Christ's example to the church. Father, I pray that you would just help each and every one of us to embrace that. And as we are thinking about the significant relationships that we have, Father, help us to flesh out what it means to be willing to sacrificially submit to the people in our lives. Thank you, Jesus. In your name we pray. Amen.